But the P-80 is not designed for naval warfare. The U.S. Navy must have a jet of its own to take on the Japanese in the Pacific. This would change aviation history. You are watching Secret Allied Aircraft of World War II here on the History Channel. By 1944, Allied naval fighters such as the Corsair have reached the limits of their developmental potential in speed and firepower. But U.S. intelligence sources know Japan is seeking to build versions of the revolutionary German jet and rocket planes. The U.S. Navy realizes it will need its own jet fighters.
The main difficulty in deploying the early jets on carriers is to do with their speed. You need a bigger boost off the deck, and it's a much trickier landing at a shallower angle and a higher speed on a very small strip.
Then the Navy got an idea. Why not develop an aircraft that would have the gentle coming aboard characteristics, if you will, of a conventional propeller-driven airplane, and yet on the other hand would have the performance potential of a jet airplane. And out of this came the Ryan Fireball, the FR-1, which had a small radial piston engine in the nose and then a small turbojet engine in the tail cone of the aircraft, fed by two wing root air inlets.
As the U.S. Navy raced to introduce the Fireball, British scientists were working on an even more radical solution to these problems. The impetus for their effort was the imminent invasion of the Japanese home islands.
The one thing that the British lacked was big aircraft carriers, and therefore they would lack air cover for any potential invasion fleet.
The answer was an aircraft unique in aviation history, a jet-powered flying boat fighter. It is nicknamed the Squirt. Its test pilot is Captain Eric Brown.
It was big for a fighter, but it had good performance. It had two axial flow engines and well armed, maneuverable. It had everything, in fact, that you could expect from such a design.
Despite its ugly shape, the Squirt could reach speeds of over 500 miles an hour. And because it did not need a heavy undercarriage or complicated landing gear, it was very maneuverable in the air. But operating from water was dangerous.
It was a very pleasant aircraft to fly, but I had a problem occur on landing. I touched down and I was running along at about 100 miles an hour, quite smoothly, when there was a tremendous crash.
Brown had struck a piece of wood floating in the water.
It shot out like a cannon and struck one of the floats, knocking the float clean off, the starboard float, and the aircraft cartwheeled over. The cockpit, of course, was upside down in the water at this stage.
Brown was lucky to escape the sinking plane.
I got out of it all right, and when we looked at the hull after, we found that a hole about 4 feet square had been cut in the hull by this mast.
Hidden among the palm trees on the Pacific Lagoon, the Squirt could swoop up to escort attacking Allied bombers or defend invasion craft from Japanese jets.
I would say it was a sound concept, and if the Japanese or the Far Eastern War hadn't concluded when it did, I think it would have been a very useful adjunct to our forces there.
But the American Fireball and the British Squirt are overtaken by advancing technology. In late 1945, a pure jet fighter successfully lands on a carrier for the first time. It is flown by the Squirt's test pilot, Eric Brown. However, the plans for an invasion of Japan include more than just new jet fighters. To fight an aerial war over intercontinental distances, Allied scientists make a technological leap that defies the imagination. The biggest man-made machine ever devised, and it's made out of ice. watching secret Allied aircraft of World War II here on the History Channel. In 1942, an unexpected guest pays a visit to Prime Minister Winston Churchill at his official residence in the English countryside. He is Lord Louis Mountbatten, Churchill's chief of combined operations.
As it happens, Churchill's in the bath, but that doesn't stop Mountbatten. He goes in and he drops into the water of the bath a block of what looks like ice. Churchill's a bit surprised by this, but he notices the ice is not melting. It's a very special kind of ice. It's called pykrete.
Pykrete is essentially ice mixed with wood slurry. The effect the wood slurry has on the ice is it doubles the tensile strength of ice.
Pykrete is a super ice as strong as concrete. Mountbatten plans to build giant iceberg aircraft carriers out of this new material.
Pykrete was the invention of a very eccentric English scientist by the name of Geoffrey Pike. He had discovered by trial and error that if you mixed ordinary ice water with, of all things, sawdust, it slowed down the rate at which the ice melted. The result was a kind of ice concrete.
In the cold waters of the Atlantic or the northern Pacific, a ship made of pykrete could remain stationed out to sea for years at a time. Mountbatten wanted a fleet of ice carriers to extend Allied power across the globe.
The advantages of a pykrete carrier would be that it provides, in essence, a floating airfield, a whole airfield where you can put squadrons of aircraft. Maintenance levels are low, and the stuff is so dense, they are virtually indestructible.
But the pykrete carrier would not simply be an iceberg which would melt over time. It will be designed to last indefinitely.
The design concept was called Habakkuk, or HMS Habakkuk, and this was to be a floating block of ice which was 2,000 feet long and 300 feet wide, constructed out of 40 feet blocks of pykrete.
The pykrete aircraft carrier was essentially a giant refrigerator. It was composed of blocks of ice, but through the middle ran pipes, and through these pipes ran coolant.
Several times larger than the Statue of Liberty, Habakkuk would have been the largest floating construction ever built. By comparison, the biggest ship afloat at the time was the luxury liner Queen Mary, which weighed in at 86,000 tons. The Habakkuk would weigh 2 million tons. After Mountbatten's visit, Churchill writes a memo on December 7, 1942. He writes, "The advantages of a floating island or islands, even if only used as refueling depots for aircraft, are dazzling." The memo was stamped in red, "Action this day." But American help is required to undertake this vast construction project. In August 1943, senior Allied commanders meet at the Hotel Frontenac in Canada. Mountbatten plans to sell his vision of using pykrete to Admiral King, head of the U.S. Navy.
During one session of the Frontenac Conference, Mountbatten brings in 2 blocks of ice. One is ordinary ice, the other is pykrete. Suddenly, Mountbatten takes out his revolver and he fires into the ordinary ice, which just kind of splinters. Everyone is completely confused by what Mountbatten is up to. And he takes his revolver and he fires at the pykrete, which is so strong, of course, that the bullet bounces off. In fact, it ricochets into Admiral King and nicks his leg.
Fortunately, Admiral King is unfazed and impressed by this unorthodox demonstration. The Americans agree to help build a prototype of Habakkuk. Driving down from the Aleutian Islands, a fleet of Habakkuks could launch both fighters and giant B-29 bombers against Japan. Building the Habakkuk and its sister ships would negate the need to capture Japanese-held Pacific Islands for Allied air bases. Tens of thousands of Allied lives would be saved from jungle fighting. But the ice ships are never launched. The money and resources needed to build them are diverted to other projects.
The project was eventually cancelled for a number of reasons. I think the first of which was because the war was at that stage being won by more conventional methods. A lot of conventional aircraft were coming on stream, and so the tide was turning against Germany and also against Japan.
By the time the prototype of the Pykrete aircraft carrier was ready, the war had moved on. America was already building the atomic bomb. It had already started to build large numbers of new aircraft carriers. In effect, time had run out for Pykrete.
The day of the maverick inventor was drawing to a close. The need to develop revolutionary new technology took second place to winning the war with less risky methods. America's vast industrial powerhouse was churning out thousands of conventional planes every month. And small escort carriers could be mass-produced by the hundreds, giving the Allies the vital platform they needed to dominate the seas. But the ice ships, although never launched, have not been forgotten.
Since World War II, there have been numerous proposals to build commercial ships or indeed floating islands made out of Pykrete. The latest idea is to build such an island that would house what would be an independent community, free of other governments in the world and free of any kind of taxation.
World War II saw the birth of a whole range of radical new technologies. In the frenzy of innovation, not all projects were successful. Some failed through lack of support or resources, some because of technical limitations, and some were simply too far ahead of their time.
Many of these secret Allied aircraft projects didn't make it into combat, but that's not the point. They were the products of great minds willing to think outside the obvious, and that's what creates the spirit of progress.
These are individuals that are facing real-world crises and challenges. When you understand what they were trying to do, sometimes these design choices, as flawed or as odd or as weird as they may be, start to make a lot better sense. And it is very surprising sometimes when you see how these return in very dramatic form many years later in much more successful fashion.
Charles Zimmerman's original flying flapjack didn't really take off, but his dream of vertical takeoff has inspired aircraft designers ever since.
When you take a look at the tilt rotor that you see today with the V-22 or the XV-15 that preceded it, these are really the technical heirs of the kind of approach and work that we first saw undertaken by Charlie Zimmerman with the V-173.
Another World War II maverick who lived to defy the odds was Jack Northrop. After the war, he tried to build more fantastic planes for the military, including the XV-35 flying wing bomber, originally slated to bomb Berlin. But the military remained skeptical of flying wings that were difficult to control without the existence of computer technology.
After World War II, Northrop built a large flying wing bomber, and this proved very successful. Yet again, though, it was too radical for the military, so it was never put into production. And that cost Northrop a lot of money. As a result, he lost control of his company.
But Jack Northrop would have the last laugh.
Before he died, he was taken to where Northrop was working on the B-2, and he looked at the assembled individuals there who included a galaxy of Northrop designers and engineering personnel, and he said, "Now I know why God has let me live so long."
Northrop's World War II flying wing is the forefather of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, which flies over the Mojave Desert today, just as its predecessor did when it first ventured into the skies. The B-2 will still be in service on the 100th anniversary of the legendary XP-79. In the end, Northrop and his fellow mavericks proved one thing: genius is the ultimate weapon.
Japan, 1945, an empire in defeat. Yet, even as the Japanese warlords surrender aboard the U.S.